I'd like to call to order the June 7th, 2021 regular board meeting of the State College Area School District Board of Directors. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone who is here with us this evening and those viewing with us remotely. And I'd like to announce the board held an executive session on May 24th and prior to this meeting regarding personnel and negotiations. Board members with an agenda before you, are there any changes to the agenda as presented? Okay. For our audience this evening, public comment is provided at the end of the meeting as well as prior to any action items or votes by the board. And you can use the raise hand function in Zoom for that. Dr. O'Donnell will now be reviewing some of the housekeeping items related to our remote format.
Thank you, Amber. As you will note, the board and a small number of district administrators have returned to in-person meetings. Due to space limitations and physical distancing protocols, all other presenters and the public will participate remotely. During the meeting, the IT help desk is available. If the community encounters technical difficulties, you may email itsupport@scasy.org or call 814-231-7743 for assistance. Public comment may be made at the end of our agenda, as Amber mentioned, as well as prior to the board taking action on an individual action item. For community members who wish to make comment, please use the raise hand feature in the Zoom program accessed under the Participants tab. Thank you.
Great, thank you. At this time, we'll have a roll call of board members.
Dr. Bader.
Here.
Ms. Bedell.
Here.
Ms. Brandt.
Here.
Ms. Concepcion.
Here.
Dr. Duffy.
Here.
Mr. Blizzard.
Here.
Mr. Hutchinson.
Here.
Mr. Leos.
Here.
Ms. Sidney. Here.
Okay. At this time, we have communications on our agenda, and I'd like to call on Dr. O'Donnell for the superintendent's update.
Thank you very much. I do just have a few items. On Friday, our 2021 year concluded, and we're very grateful to have ended on a positive note with a beautiful graduation on Saturday. Thank you to everyone who was able to participate in graduation. Thus far, the feedback was very positive by both graduates, their families, and our employees. And we are considering this for next June, as we need to make planning decisions this month if we wanted to rent the BJC. So we will keep you posted on our planning, and we want to make sure we have a chance to speak with the student leaders for the class of 22. Regarding graduation, as my speech began blowing away, there was something in the right margin on my second page that I didn't say, and I just wanted to say it here. And I just want to thank Jeff Kissel, the class advisor for the class of 2021, because some of the events that were hosted and for the seniors this year were really driven by Jeff's energy, and he made it happen, and he was there to the last minute of each of the events, including prom. And I just wanted to say that publicly. I just appreciate all that Jeff has done for those senior students. On to the next item, our boys track and field program continued its remarkable run by winning the 2021 PIAA State Track and Field Championship. The boys took 7 medals, including silvers in the 4x800 and 4x100 meter relays. High jumper Conrad Moore also claimed silver, although he jumped the same height as the person that got gold. It's a long story. And Brady Bigger received the bronze in the 1600 meter. So congratulations to the boys team. Also, the girls team finished 8th, led by Shannon Mullen taking the silver in the triple jump. So congratulations to both the boys and the girls teams. In regard to fall planning, on June 21st, we plan to bring forward an update to the board regarding our fall planning. For sure, we will share a status update regarding the educational model choices. Now that we've finished the school year, I want to make sure that we thank all of our faculty, staff, and administrators for their extraordinary efforts to support students throughout the year. Their commitment and caring spirit made it possible for us to have such a successful year despite all of the challenges. I hope that everyone really finds some time to have a much well-deserved break this summer. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell. Board members, any communication items? Okay. Legislative update, David and Lori. Sounds like there's some legislation going on in Harrisburg that we need to be aware of.
There are a couple of bills that were introduced on the floor for discussion today.
Is it okay if I do this? Okay. So for Senate Bill 1, the key areas of concern with this bill are that it removes local control from the charter school authorizing process. It doesn't address the critical need for charter funding reform, and it creates an automatic escalator to the Education Improvement Tax Credit, the EITC program, which will shift resources away from the majority of students in the Commonwealth. The most significant flaw in this bill is the creation of a new statewide authorizing commission that allows charter schools to make an end around local taxpayer control and diminishing any chance to ensure that charter schools are accountable and responsive to their local communities. The statewide authorizer proposed in Senate Bill 1 undermines Pennsylvania's longstanding tradition of local control, creates a system that allows charter schools to shop for the authorizer with the least oversight and to transfer oversight away from their local school board, essentially silencing the voice of the school district and the taxpayers footing the bill for the charters. The other bill, Senate Bill 733, establishes the Education Opportunity Account Scholarship Program for exceptional students. It is the latest iteration of school vouchers. It gives the impression of seeking to help students with special needs, but what it does is has a negative effect on the student population due to implementation and results in funding cuts to public schools. The potential financial impact of SB 733 on school districts could easily total around $600 million based on estimated program utilization. The estimate does not account for students with 504 plans who don't have an IEP or children diagnosed with a medical disability. It would also create an incentive for parents to have their children identified as gifted in order to access a voucher. Non-public schools are not governed by the IDEA Act, IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act, which guarantees students with disabilities and their parents with significant rights, services, and protections related to the student's education. Under SB 733, the state would be prohibited from requiring non-public schools receiving state education resources to comply with IDEA or state regulations governing special education, even though those resources would be allocated under the proposed voucher program. Ultimately, families and students are more vulnerable without these protections. State money for these vouchers would be deducted from a school district subsidy. The bill calculates the voucher by taking 90% of all state revenue provided to a school district, including property tax relief money, transportation subsidy, and pension reimbursement, and dividing by a school district's average daily membership to calculate the base voucher amount. So for students with disabilities, the base voucher amount would then be increased based on the category of disability. Vouchers can be spent on services beyond K through 12 education, like higher education tuition and textbooks, 529 college savings plans, private financial management firm fees, fees for college entrance exams, post-secondary course prep, and costs associated with an industry certification. So those were presented on the floor of the Senate today, the Pennsylvania Senate. And then the last thing I have is at the federal level. The U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights issued a request for information asking members of the public to submit written comments on the administration of school discipline in schools. This information will assist the Office for Civil Rights in determining what policy guidance, technical assistance, or other resources may help schools improve school climate and safety, and to ensure equal access to education programs and activities consistent with the civil rights laws that OCR enforces. The Office of Civil Rights data collection has shown persistent disparities over time in the use of exclusionary discipline. The data from 2017-18 shows, for example, that Black students represented 15% of student enrollment, but 38% of students who received one or more out-of-school suspensions, and students with disabilities represented 13% of student enrollment, but 25% of students who received one or more out-of-school suspensions. So the federal the Department of Education is looking at an issue that's familiar to all of us. So you can go to the Department of Ed website for more information about this and to share information that you might have as a community member or as a board member or administrator about this. That's
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. David?
The only thing I'll add to what Lori said is that the legislation at the state level is moving really quickly. Here you're bringing the education community today, it's already on the floor of the Senate.
Okay. Thanks, that sounds concerning, and the voucher-related legislation could really cost school districts a significant amount of money, it sounds like. Okay. Gretchen, is there an update from COG?
Yes, there is. There was a rather long general forum meeting on May 24th, and the general forum has voted to pass a refinancing of the loan for the two loans, one for the parks, one for the pools. And what that means for the public is that the Whitehall Road Park is going to happen. And so and it's been refinanced, I believe at 1.3%, if I remember correctly. And that will save money, which is a really good thing. And there is an additional amount that could be approved later for borrowing that would, my understanding is, pay for restrooms. And right now, that is not included. But the good news is that it will actually happen, and it's been secured. So they did vote to pass that on May 24th. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on then to routine approvals, if we could have a motion to approve the routine approval listing as presented on the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Questions on routine approvals? Laurel?
Yes, I just wanted to say two things. One is that it is very nice to see student travel on here again.
It is.
And, so very excited that people are beginning to plan that, especially the international travel really is important for so many students. And even if they don't get to go, they get to hear about their peers, so it's great.
And
The
that
other
trip to
question.
Italy was one of the first things that got
It was one-
canceled
yeah.
when the pandemic was
Yep.
coming down on us. Yep.
So I just wanted to mention that. And the second one was, I noticed on the technology service contracts that we have IXL on there for renewal. And I understand this past year, we haven't really been able to look at that, and even in the cyber environment, it's maybe helpful, but I hope at some point in this coming year, we can revisit that. We moved away from it, then came back. I'm hoping that it could be looked at again.
Well, Chris Merritt's with us if you have any questions of that tonight. Otherwise, we can consider that for CCL.
Yeah, I wasn't going to try to, like I said, I know that I was more putting it out there, just having seen it, it jogged my memory.
Okay. All right. Any other questions on routine approvals? Any public comment on routine approvals? You can use the raise hand function in Zoom. Okay. Seeing none, we will have a roll call vote.
Mr. Hutchinson,
Yes.
Mr. Leos,
Yes.
Ms. Sidney. Yes. Dr. Bader,
Yes.
Ms. Bedell,
Yes.
Ms. Brandt,
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion,
Yes.
Dr. Duffy,
Yes.
Mr. Fazzard.
Yes.
Okay, so that has passed.
Oh,
It-
I would like to
Oh, yes, sir.
welcome Mike Fisher. He's our new physical plant, director of physical plant. He'll begin on July 12th, so appreciate the approval there, and we're looking forward to transitioning Mike into the district here in July, so thank you.
Yeah, welcome. We're really excited to have him aboard. So. Okay, so under action items, the first action item in a change from the agenda, is, if you had looked at it previously to today, item A will be a motion to approve the summer 2021 health and safety plan. So this is shown in attachment 5A.
Second.
Okay, that has been moved and seconded. Dr. O'Donnell, would you like
Sure.
to
I know we have
introduce
Jean Knaus, who joined us, and will, obviously the key aspects of the plan include alignment with the CDC and the DOH, and it's a much smaller plan document than you've seen, but we will open it up to questions for you. We in there do identify how we would account during the summer for vaccinated people, and to be consistent with the state and obviously the CDC. And have been questioned what happens at the end of the month if things change. Well, if the PADOH were to change, we would keep the board updated to any changes, obviously. But we're requesting to align with them at this time. We don't have a ton of programs, but we did want to make sure that before we made changes, we did return to the board. We will have to return to the board, as I understand it, with Pennsylvania Department of Education requirement for a fall safety plan to be approved by the end of July, which would be brought to you, it'd be separate than this. So with some of our in-school programs, athletic programs, and our music programs, which occur throughout the summer, we felt this would be appropriate to bring forward as they kick off. I think we have some students in school tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. So,
Questions?
any questions? And
I have a few, but,
Jean's
yeah.
online.
My main question was about, which I hadn't actually noticed this until you just mentioned it, Dr. O'Donnell, that it says here, should there be further updates from CDC and DOH, our recommendation is this plan automatically adopt the new guidelines. And I guess one of my concerns would be if at the end of June, the Pennsylvania Department of Health removes the mask mandate entirely, but we have students who are unvaccinated in groups together, there's not herd immunity within that group if we're talking about young children who have not had an opportunity to be vaccinated, and whether that should be considered separately from the statewide mask mandate in terms of groups of young children together.
I mean, if our health and safety team felt like it's not the right direction to go, we could postpone and wait till we return to the board. But I think if, right now with how we're running summer programs, we don't have a lot of students in school. In most instances, we are able to distance students. But for indoor experiences, you're right. If they did remove the mask mandate, this current proposal does allow us to shift to align with the DOH.
I think another issue or thing that we would definitely monitor would be our numbers, and we've had
Oh, I'm
0
sorry, Jean, we
cases.
can't hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think another thing that would play into this would be our numbers, and we've had 0 cases in the last 3 weeks. So I think if it moved to that direction, we would monitor that very closely. And if we had any cases, I think we would definitely reconsider any abrupt change that we would make, that we would adopt by CDC. But everything, like Bob said, we would run through a health and safety committee.
Let's see. And this doesn't necessarily roll over into that decision doesn't roll over into the fall necessarily when we have much larger numbers of elementary students, for example, in buildings.
Correct. And this would give us a nice baseline to see what that's going to be like next fall. If that is the process, we'll know in the summer if it worked with our smaller numbers.
Questions? Dan?
Just to ask, Jean, I'm sorry to have to ask you to repeat it. We had a hard time hearing for the first part of what you had to say. It sounds better now. But I got the impression from what you just said that in the last few weeks, the incidence rates have been at 0 in terms of cases within the schools including younger kids.
Correct.
So you're conceivably, the health and safety team could recommend a protocol by which let's say, requirements for masking might depend upon the occurrence of infection that was happening, or if there was no occurrence of infection, you would continue with removing the mask mandate?
We would only remove the mask mandate if CDC and DOH aligned with that. And then we would continue in that model. I think Amber's question was, would we automatically do that with the students not being vaccinated and technically within that group, them not having herd immunity? And
Right.
My guess is when we would run this by the health and safety team before we made any changes, we would also consider the numbers. And so if we are still at 0
Right.
and the CDC and DOH support removing the mask mandate, I think we would probably move in that direction, also monitoring closely. Now, as soon as we would have a case, I think that would bring this back to the table to discuss the safety of that.
You bet. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Laura?
I had a similar concern, and I'm wondering if, I think it might just be confusing to people if they were to look at this and see the word automatically. I would feel more comfortable if it said something like, at the discretion, that we will adopt those at the discretion of the superintendent and the safety team, instead of automatically, because that does give you, and there may even turn out to be local ordinances that are tighter
Not
than the,
anymore.
not right now, but we don't know what'll happen. So I would really prefer if we formally said that it was a discretionary thing to adopt them.
Rather than automatically.
Right, I just think it might be, I can see people thinking, well, you said automatically. You were very straightforward about that. So I think if we don't mean automatically, but we mean based on the recommendation of our health and safety team and the judgment of local administrators, then that's what we need to make clear to people.
I agree
I
with
think-
that.
I think adding a clause there instead of automatic to state at the discretion of the health and
Yeah.
safety team would.
Amber?
Yes, Scott?
Yeah, I actually disagree with that because, if CDC and Department of Health are our experts who we're supposed to be following, I don't know if the CDC or Department of Health gives discretion to local areas to apply or remove the mandate, okay, that's our discretion. But if the mask mandate is removed, I don't quite know who we are if we are have more expertise than Department of Health or CDC to maintain a mask mandate. Again, I'm talking about the mandate. I'm not talking about discretionary use or situational use or things like that. I would hope that the CDC and Department of Health would only remove that mandate when it's pertinent for the population at large. And if not, then they would phase the mandate the same as opening was phased, in some way like that. So I would really, I would not support, leaving that discretion at the local level if the discretion isn't given by our scientific community.
Amy?
One suggestion, though, I have is that I think the statewide masking mandate is really approaching, it's trying to consider the widest swath of situations, which is going to be people in work situations, which are typically adults, shopping, restaurants, those kind of venues. And the school environment is pretty unique in that we're talking about potentially, especially with our summer camps and other things, we're talking about having significant numbers of young children who aren't eligible to be vaccinated in a concentrated situation. So, and unfortunately, while the ideal, I agree with you, would be that the state was addressing that issue through the Department of Health or through the Department of Education, my guess is, just like at the beginning of the pandemic, that might get overlooked. And so I think it's up to us to be responsible to take good care of those kids. And we are fortunate enough to have, appropriate types of experts with the epidemiologists on the safety team to refer to. So I think that it's prudent to at least have them kind of have a touch point and weigh in. And I totally agree with what Jean said. I think in likelihood, this will be a moot point if the trends currently continue. We're going to have very low cases in the county, and that will mean that we're in a pretty good situation where it's not going to be much of a concern. But with the caveat that we'll have some college students returning potentially in early August, which may or may not have impacts on our community, being able to know that we're going to just keep tabs on that, I think will just give a lot of peace of mind for the parents of those young kids.
I think my concern with the DOH, that so far DOH has talked about removing the mask mandate when we reach 70% vaccination in the state. And what we know is the elementary kids are 0% vaccinated, and they're in a concentrated environment of individuals who are not vaccinated, which is a different mix or milieu than the 70% statewide that the state is talking about for the mask mandate.
And I'm talking about for the majority of general public situations, school situation is pretty different.
But those, and I agree, but those elementary kids are also among the lowest risk. So, I think we go down a slippery slope whenever we try to become the experts over others who are providing those mandates. And again, if there's discretion within whatever occurs in June or whatever, I fully get it and I support that. But if it's removed, I don't think we have I don't think we're justified to keep it in place if it's otherwise removed.
Amber?
Yes. Gretchen?
So this has gotten me thinking about what's happening locally versus what's happening nationwide, right? And we've already seen that the virus will, increase in some places and almost, have no cases in other places. And so it could be that, and with the college town, caveat there, it's a real possibility. We don't know, nobody knows what's going to happen. Hopefully, things will be maintained as they have been the past few weeks. But if you allow some local control, then if you were to have a local outbreak, you could try to do something about it. But if you give that away and there's a local outbreak, then I think, as Laurel mentioned, then locally we could not do anything about it. And so just in terms of how it's so nuanced depending on where it is, it might be a good idea to maintain some local control just in case that were to happen. So just adding another thought to the local versus national.
That makes sense in terms of
lens.
responding to the situation as we have it here in our schools right now, or in the future. Yeah.
And of course, hopefully this will not even be a conversation after K through 11-year-olds are able to be vaccinated. So hopefully that'll be September, October, but we shall see.
Okay.
So just
Jim?
like a point of order, I guess, is Laurel, were you suggesting we amend that to? I don't think you made a formal motion, so
Well,
that's what I
that's the
was
thing,
just
that
asking.
it wasn't written even as a formal motion, so I wasn't sure how to go about it.
Okay.
But if the formal motion, if there is a formal motion, I would want that included. And again, I understand what you're saying, Scott, and I think that's a very good point. At the same time, we've seen different pockets in different places, and giving our administrators the ability to respond very quickly, to me, makes sense. And we leave a lot to their discretion often, and I just am concerned about someone seeing that. Also, sometimes what gets communicated is not actually what's being said by the Department of Health and the CDC. People hear sometimes what they want to see. Oh, it's free for all now. That's not what they've said at all. And this, I think, would just give the administrators a little firmer backing that we know, that we trust them and their ability to interpret locally.
And that health and safety team that's been,
Right.
I think, really critical all along in terms of helping us make the right decisions.
If you do change it, I believe that sentence should be amended following the updates from the CDC and DOH, comma, this plan at the discretion of the district administration in collaboration with the health and safety team adopt the new guidelines.
I'd move that if you can put the words on it.
So the key is, instead of automatically, we'd want to word
Right.
it with, at the discretion of the district administration in collaboration with the health and safety.
Yes.
That's really how it's operated all year.
I second that motion to the amendment.
Okay.
If you're motioning it, Laurel.
I am.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm trying to be sure I know what's on the table. So do we need to vote on the amendment now?
I think the motion was, I think the amendment would be if you wanted to take that out, because I think it was moved with that in there.
Well, we need to amend it with that adjusted wording.
Okay.
Scott, do we need to vote on the amended wording that Laurel proposed?
I'm going to defer to Lynn. Lynn, what do you have as the motion?
So,
The motion is to approve the health and safety plan as presented in attachment 5I. So we need to amend that, right?
Okay.
what do you have as the board secretary written down that there have been motions and amendments on the floor?
So I have a motion to approve the 2021 Health and Safety Plan. If they make an amendment, then we need to,
Yeah, so you don't have an amendment yet.
no.
Okay, so, I didn't think we had a motion on the table yet either, though.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought you just made one.
Yes, that's,
And
I
I
thought
thought
I made a
Amy-
motion, and my motion was this with discretion added.
So wouldn't we first have to vote on the item that Lynn already has in the minutes and then vote on the amendment?
Right. So I have Bedell as one and Duffy as two.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just missed that part.
So there
Yeah.
is a motion
I
and a second on
apologize.
the table, but someone can move to amend the motion, right?
And
Yes.
then that is what I am moving to do.
So we need to vote on whether or not to amend,
Right, to accept the amendment.
to accept the amendment that Laurel proposed. It's the next vote we have to do then,
Yes.
correct?
Mhm.
Okay. Okay, because that's been moved and seconded. So discussion around the amendment.
Amber?
Yes,
Yeah,
Scott?
sorry. So I'm going to continue to push on this. So I find it ironic that on one hand, we want to listen to our Health and Safety Committee, which I agree, and here we have our Health and Safety Committee making a recommendation that the plan go in with an automatic language, and now we're choosing to not listen to them, and we're going to put it in what we want. So what are we doing? Are we listening to them, or are we not listening to them, or are we just picking and choosing based on whatever we want to see in the plan? So I just find that ironic.
I think that's a poor characterization of what just happened. I think,
I think it's
I
a
think,
pretty
let me
precise
finish, please, because I have the floor right now.
Okay.
I think we trust our health and safety team, and we have on a large scale repeatedly. I think we also acknowledge that sometimes when documents come forward, what language we get in front of us may or may not always represent the intent of what was intended by that community. So I think that that community very reasonably wants to defer to those organizations with all the appropriate nuances of what's going on locally. So it's to imply that the fact that we want to make an amendment, to imply that that is some kind of distrust in our health and safety team or a rejection of their recommendation, I think is a mischaracterization. I think this is a small nuance that we want to make sure there's a touch point, that people have an opportunity to look at the entire environment before automatically making assumptions.
And it's a further mischaracterization to say that I used any words like mistrust or anything like that.
You just said we were going to reject them, so
So
Okay,
that,
let's-
excuse me, I have the floor
Okay.
right now, Amy. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I didn't use those words. You're making assumptions and you're making your own implications based on what my comments were.
Dan?
An additional perspective on this, and I appreciate Scott's fundamental support essentially for the work of the health and safety team in terms of the draft that they provided us, but they provided us with a draft, which we collectively, I think, need to look at and review. And as I look at this and I consider this question about whether, it sort of comes down to a question of local control, but also local responsibility for events. We can't count on the Department of Health or the CDC to know exactly what happens in our community. We can only know locally, for example, if there happens to be an outbreak among young kids. We can only know that locally. They're not, these sweeping recommendations they're making don't take into account the fact that we may happen to discover locally that there's a need for greater mitigation, which we had not anticipated. With all the best of intentions and highest hopes that we could make this happen without the mitigation, we may discover it may be necessary to reinstitute that. So I'm inclined to go along with the idea, let's give ourselves the authority to make changes if we need them, if something bad happens. Hopefully it won't. Hopefully it won't. These guidelines will help, and the guidance we get from the CDC and the Department of Health will give us what we need. We can go forward with that. But as Jean was saying earlier, if we assess and discover that cases are popping up, and we discover through through contact tracing, whatever it is, that this is a problem, we need to be able to respond to that. So that's my take on this. I think it's important to consider that this is really about those closest to the problem, closest to the question, need to have the authority to intervene as needed.
Yeah, I guess
I'll
to me it's
also
about
say that any
responsiveness,
updates that have come through CDC and DOH, we have taken to the health and safety team just so that we're all on the same page and vetted that through. So it does make sense.
yeah. So it would be consistent with the process you've been following.
It actually would, yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so I think we should go ahead and vote on the amendment. I think I need to take public comment on the amendment. And at this time, for anyone making public comment, it is the motion on the table is not the approval of the health and safety plan. It's whether or not to amend it to include the discretion of the superintendent and in collaboration with the health and safety team on any revisions pending CDC and DOH guidelines. So if we could keep any comments confined to that. I do see Catherine Facey has a hand raised. If you would like to speak, you may unmute yourself and introduce yourself, and then you would have 2 minutes to speak. If you could just tell us where you reside within the district as well. Ms. Facey, I don't know if you were unmuted yet.
Did they
Okay,
change the
maybe
wording?
didn't mean to have a hand raised. Okay. If you're not, yeah. Okay, it looks like you're not unmuting, so I will assume you're not wishing to speak at this time then. Okay, would anyone else like to make a public comment? Okay, then we'll be voting on the amendment.
Mr. Leos,
Yes.
Ms. Sidney,
Yes.
Dr. Bader,
Yes.
Ms. Bedell,
Yes.
Ms. Brandt,
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion,
Yes.
Dr. Duffy,
Yes.
Mr. Fazard,
No.
Mr. Hutchinson.
Yes.
Okay, so that item, the amendment has passed, so now the motion on the table is a motion to approve the summer 2021 health and safety plan as amended by Ms. Sidney's amendment. So we can still discuss the health and safety plan if people have further questions on the plan we have in front of us. Yes, Jim?
So, and I think the plan had changed since I first saw it
Oh,
in
okay.
in terms of the notification, if there's a case in the school, is not to just notify the employees, but also any students that might be involved, or any student's family that might be involved. I think that was a change that you sent over this afternoon, Dr. O'Donnell.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, so I
continuing.
agree with that. I think that's.
Continuing the existing.
Yeah, I think that's the right thing,
I agree.
so.
Yeah, and there was a couple wording changes. I know.
Yes.
I was going to raise tonight questions about, there was a missing comma about indoors versus outdoors, and I saw we broke that into some different bulleted points, which was much clearer, so I appreciated those small modifications. That was really helpful in delineating those two situations, because it was a little confusing at which role masking and distancing, whether it played a role in both or just in one, so that was really helpful, thanks.
Point.
But that's a good thing to point out, that there were some slight changes.
Yeah.
I did have a question about marching band particularly. So they would be allowed, with this, it says band musicians must maintain 6 feet of physical distance at all times, but that does allow for marching band to practice marching. Is that correct, Jean? Because they wouldn't be being within, that's sort of 6 feet. They might pass within 6 feet, but they're not.
Correct, and that's
Standing.
under the unvaccinated section also. So you have to kind of keep that focus too. So those that aren't
Right.
vaccinated need to maintain, but we also want to remember that maintaining a physical distance is also a 15-minute window, right? So if they're passing within that space, they're not going to be within each other's window for more than 15 minutes over a cumulative amount of time. And that kind of falls into the same way that we did our athletics, right? When you're out in the field and you're running around on football, we allowed them not to mask in the sense that they would not be physically in each other's space for that long. And I think the lineman in particular was like 4 minutes in a game, and it
Right.
seems longer, right? Because the games are longer. So we really took that in consideration in comparing the athletics and the band and making sure we had some equity there.
So this is a significant improvement in what the marching band is able to do in their practices
Correct.
compared to last year.
Correct.
Okay. All right, any other questions, Scott?
Yeah, so I also had a question relative to the proof of vaccination. So, I'm curious what people are seeing in other districts, in other organizations that are, starting to adopt follow the vaccination guidelines relative to no masks, and what's occurring relative to that documentation, who's going to have access to it, just what other people are seeing, because, there's a big public debate about vaccination passports and just how we do this, how we follow these guidelines and substantiate or trust or whatever it might be. So I'm just curious if there's any information out there about what's generally happening and what we're seeing in other districts or not.
I think because this is just for the summer, we don't know all the moving parts with our districts. From what I understand with the university, they're doing something pretty similar with uploading an image of your card for employees and college students to, at this point. I don't know how that'll change for the fall with what they're doing. But so to answer your question, I don't know what other districts around our state are doing yet. We want to have the ability to align with the CDC and allow people, because as you know, if we tried to require masks at graduation, we couldn't have enforced it. And even with recess, this really pertains to indoor experiences if you really look at it, because in the summer, for our summer programs, when the younger students go out to recess, we're talking like 12 kids in the whole playground for recess. So we believe we can keep them distanced pretty easily, so we're not going to have to require masks in that scenario with that number of students. If it was the whole school coming back under this exact plan, that would be different. So, I mean, that doesn't answer your question about what other districts are doing. We want to take a step forward and not have masks required that is in line with the CDC, because it is, it's a step I think we have evidence to take. It's supported by our health and safety team. And again, the indoor experiences are really the ones where this would take, we'd have to enforce it.
And I'll follow that up with your other question, Scott, about who would have access to this information. We are going to need to do daily attendance so that we can still contact trace if need be. So there'll be some health and safety team members, administrators who have access to this information that would give the vaccinated information to the program coordinators, who's ever running a program, or the teachers, so that they can know who's in their class that has the vaccination. So it wouldn't be everyone having the information. We would definitely make sure that we distribute that to the direct people who are taking attendance.
Yeah, which, I mean, we're providing personal health information on different items anyways, so from that standpoint. Scott, do you have any legal consideration of where, where that's going from the standpoint of, the legal aspects of requiring, people to provide that vaccination record? I mean, has there been any litigation on that yet? Any laws exempting organizations specifically or anything like that?
I haven't read about any of that, but I can tell you that I look daily for that information to search far and wide to see if something is out there. I have said to the administration that we are able to be more restrictive than the guidelines may require on a health and safety issue of this type in the exercise of our discretion as a district. And I think that what they've done is in line with what I think they're capable and authorized to do.
Okay.
Thanks.
I just want to say real quick, I happened to watch the last meeting, and unless you speak into the microphone, the people viewing it cannot hear you. Just FYI to everybody. I just witnessed that myself when I tried to watch the last meeting.
Thanks. Okay, any other questions on this? Laurel?
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. It says that people must wear masks unless they can maintain a 6-foot distance. At recess, even if there are only 3 children, will we allow them to play closer as long as they keep a mask on, or are we going to try to keep them distanced?
I think if Vern, I mean, I'm not running recess, but I think our guidance with the people that head it up is if the kids are going to be playing close to each other and they're unvaccinated, this plan requires a mask.
I'm fine with that. I wanted to make sure we were allowing that.
Yeah.
That we were allowing them to play closely, as long as they're masked.
Right. I don't.
That's what we've been doing.
Right.
And that's why the mask at recess, because at times it's hard for students to maintain that 6 feet. And so that's been a practice already.
That's fine. The way it read, I thought it might be interpreted that they have to be distanced.
Okay.
So as long as that's exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you for clarifying it.
Yeah, I don't have, this is not a question for this plan, but as we look forward to the fall, to think about what our options are in terms of vaccine documentation, because everyone who does get a vaccine, it goes into a national database, and that information should become part of a student's vaccination record at their pediatrician. So my sense is that moving forward, this just becomes part of the immunization record that because the school district is used to collecting immunization records, and that this vaccine would be not necessarily, as we go forward into the future, not necessarily different. Like, yes, now we have the vaccine cards, but it should also be part of each individual's vaccination record that's on file in their doctor's office with their, in their normal immunization record. So it might be, that might sort of streamline in the future, rather than needing to collect images of cards, it's part of the same immunization record that we're already collecting. So I guess that's not a question, but something just to think about as we move forward. So,
Jean, are there reasons for exceptions to those vaccines, the other vaccines that we collect?
There are reasons like religious exemption or health. What I would say to that is whatever the Department of Health in our education part requires us to do, we'll do. Our nurses do have access to that database, but we would require the parents to fulfill that process during registration, and then we would have our follow-up piece. So you're right, Amber, but I would imagine there's going to be something more prescriptive for us, and right now this is all we have.
okay. Yeah, and I didn't mean in terms of us requiring a vaccine that the state doesn't have on their list, because
Right.
that's a different question, I think, but that hopefully it'll be easier to collect that information as it becomes part of students and employees' vaccination records that they already have on file, rather than relying on those little cards.
Right.
Especially when they're lost.
Right, exactly. Yep. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Is there any public comment? Michelle Young, I see your hand raised. If you would like to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and where you reside in the district, and then you'll have 2 minutes to speak.
I'm Michelle Young, and I live in Ferguson Township. I have concerns about the suggested changes to the health and safety plan as written, specifically that these changes will create an inequitable and hostile environment for those students and staff who did not receive the vaccine. Current changes requiring proof of vaccination essentially puts a vaccine passport in place for staff and students. Vaccine passports create a second-class citizenry who, for medical or other reasons, are unable to prove their COVID-secure status. There would be 2 lines of people, 2 sets of rules, 2 different sets of rights. Punishment for people who made a medical decision. This is also an infringement on staff and students' rights to keep their health decisions private, forcing them to announce their vaccination status by making them wear a mask, much like a scarlet letter. Thus violating their medical privacy rights, encouraging prejudice against those unable to receive the vaccine or those who made a medical decision, eventually causing division among our SASB community. Health decisions should be left up to individuals without risk of limiting their day-to-day activities. Of note, implementation of vaccine passports has been banned in 14 states, with legislation pending in many others. In addition, mask mandates have already been removed, making masks optional for all staff and students in PA school districts, including Bald Eagle, Mifflin County, York, Bensalem, Cumberland, Montoursville, Penns Manor, Central Bucks, Rockwood, Manheim, and Council Rock. I would request that you make these changes equitable for all and make masking optional for all, allowing staff, parents, and students to make their own medical decisions privately.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else who would like to make a public comment before we vote? Okay. Jen Moeni, I see your hand raised. If you would like to unmute yourself and introduce yourself, and then you'll have 2 minutes to speak.
Hi, my name is, oh, let me turn it. Sorry. My name is Jennifer Money. I live in Ferguson Township. I would just like to highlight Penn State's numbers have had 0 cases in the past 7 days. State College School District has had 0 cases in the past 3 weeks. I think this policy is something that should be tabled for now. I would like to bring to your attention the universal codes that are violated with these medical intervention conditional requirements. The UNESCO Helsinki Code of Ethics and Nuremberg Code specifically say that there needs to be voluntary consent and that nothing can be conditional on acceptance of an experimental medical intervention. And that goes directly against these 3 universal codes of human rights. Having those that do not accept this experimental vaccination, it's just wrong. This is a medical study. It requires informed consent with no coercion. Nothing should be conditional on participation in medical intervention. Masking should not be required. It should be completely optional. There were several questions that I had. How will religious and medical exemptions be handled with this? Will they be handled the same way vaccine exemptions have been handled in the past? With research showing natural immunity, how will this be taken into account? I propose the school district treat this like any other vaccine once it is approved, but while it is still under emergency use authorization, there should be nothing conditional on its acceptance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Is anyone else here looking to make a public comment? Okay, I don't see any other hands raised. And so at this time, we will go ahead and have a roll call vote.
Ms. Zidney,
Yes.
Dr. Bader,
Yes.
Ms. Bedell,
Yes.
Ms. Brandt,
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion,
Yes.
Dr. Duffy,
Yes.
Mr. Fazzard,
No.
Mr. Hutchinson,
Yes.
Mr. Leos.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That item has passed. And just to clarify, that if the board had not approved this, then the existing health and safety plan would have continued to be in place. It wasn't this or nothing. It was the continuation. This is an amendment to the previous existing plan. Okay, so then moving on to item B is a motion to approve the 2021-2022 textbook recommendations as shown in attachment 5B.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that has been moved and seconded. Questions or discussion on the textbooks? All right, is there any public comment in regard to the textbook recommendations? Okay, then we will have a roll call vote.
Dr. Bader,
Yes.
Ms. Bedell,
Yes.
Ms. Brandt,
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion,
Yes.
Dr. Duffy,
Yes.
Mr. Fazzard,
Yes.
Mr. Hutchinson,
Yes.
Mr. Leos.
Yes.
Ms. Sidney.
Okay, that item is passed. Item C is a motion to approve the athletic training agreement with the Mount Nittany Physician Group as shown in attachment 5B, or C, I'm sorry.
So moved.
Second?
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Any questions or discussion? Is there any public comment? Okay, we'll have a roll call vote then.
Ms. Bedell?
Yes.
Ms. Brandt?
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion?
Yes.
Dr. Duffy?
Yes.
Mr. Fazard?
Yes.
Mr. Hutchinson?
Yes.
Mr. Leos?
Yes.
Ms. Sidney? Dr. Bader?
Yes.
Okay. That item has passed. Item D is a motion to award the bid for school buses as shown in attachment 5D.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Questions or discussion? Okay. Public comment? Okay, we'll have a roll call vote then.
Ms. Brandt?
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion?
Yes.
Dr. Duffy?
Yes.
Mr. Fazard?
Yes.
Mr. Hutchinson?
Yes.
Mr. Leos?
Yes.
Ms. Sidney?
Yes.
Dr. Bader?
Yes.
Ms. Bedell?
Yes.
Okay, that item has passed. Item E is a motion to approve the purchase of fitness center replacement equipment. This is shown in attachment 5E.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Questions or discussion? Okay. Public comment? Okay, we'll have a roll call vote then.
Ms. Concepcion?
Yes.
Dr. Duffy?
Yes.
Mr. Fazard?
Yes.
Mr. Hutchinson?
Yes.
Mr. Leos?
Yes.
Ms. Sidney? Dr. Bader?
Yes.
Ms. Bedell?
Yes.
Ms. Brandt?
Yes.
Okay, that item has passed. Item F is a motion to approve the 2021-2022 final budget as shown in attachment 5F.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Questions or discussion? Okay, public comment. Okay, we will have a roll call vote then.
Dr. Duffy?
Yes.
Mr. Fazard?
Yes.
Mr. Hutchinson?
Yes.
Mr. Leos?
Yes.
Ms. Sidney? Dr. Bader?
Yes.
Ms. Bedell?
Yes.
Ms. Brandt?
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion?
Yes. Okay, that item has passed. Item G is a motion to approve the 2021-2022 Homestead Farmstead Exclusion Resolution as shown in attachment 5G.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Any questions or discussion? All right, any public comment? Okay, then we'll have a roll call vote.
Mr. Fazard?
Yes.
Mr. Hutchinson?
Yes.
Mr. Leos?
Yes.
Ms. Sidney? Dr. Bader?
Yes.
Ms. Bedell?
Yes.
Ms. Brandt?
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion?
Yes.
Dr. Duffy?
Yes.
Okay, that item has passed. Item H is a motion to approve the 2021-2022 annual real estate tax installment payment resolution as shown in attachment 5H.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Questions or discussion? Okay. Public comment. Okay, we will have a roll call vote then.
Mr. Hutchinson?
Yes.
Mr. Leos?
Yes.
Ms. Sidney? Dr. Bader?
Yes.
Ms. Bedell?
Yes.
Ms. Brandt?
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion?
Yes.
Dr. Duffy?
Yes.
Mr. Fazard?
Yes.
Okay, that item has passed. Item I is a motion to approve the 2021-2022 supplemental property tax rebate resolution as shown in attachment 5I.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Any questions or discussion?
Amber,
Sorry.
I just, every time this comes up, I want to encourage the community to look closely at their bills and to note that they have the, to look at the income scale and that there's an opportunity for tax relief. So look out for that.
Yes, and using the same process that they can use to apply to the state of Pennsylvania as well.
Yes.
So it's not an extra set of forms. It's,
Right.
they can file the same forms with our district offices. Okay, any other questions? Any public comment? Okay, we'll have a roll call vote.
Mr. Leos?
Yes.
Ms. Sidney? Dr. Bader?
Yes.
Ms. Bedell?
Yes.
Ms. Brandt?
Yes.
Ms. Concepcion?
Yes.
Dr. Duffy?
Yes.
Mr. Fazard?
Yes.
Mr. Hutchinson?
Yes.
Okay, that item has passed. So moving on to information discussion then, and I'm going to take my mask off because we passed the plan that allowed for vaccinated people to take their masks off.
If you submitted your vaccination card.
I would be happy to do so. But I'm not an employee of the district. I don't know that there's a form for board members to submit it, but I'd be happy to do so. Yeah. Actually, I do too. Mine's in my purse right here. Okay, so item A under Facilities and Grounds is the Radio Park Elementary Traffic Study as shown in attachment 6A.
So this was brought to you as an information item several weeks ago, hoping to bring it as an action tonight. However, subsequently, we've determined that Ferguson Township may be willing to assist us with this study and incomplete or at least impartial. So right now, we're on hold. Obviously, we need to have school back in session before we do the study anyways. We're working with Ferguson Township. We just wanted to follow up with you to let you know that we will be pursuing that. If we need to expend any dollars on a true study or a portion thereof, we will come back to you later in the fall.
Okay. Lori?
Thank you for that. I just want to say, I think he may be watching. I got to walk to school with Ollie and his dad to get a sense for what it was like for them to walk to school. And I think there's great merit in this effort. And additionally, I know that Ferguson's going to be taking a look at this, but I think it would be useful for our district to take a look at crossing guards from Atherton, in crossing Atherton, and also where you've got 4 inputs and outputs of traffic happening there. I think there's great merit for that. And I think that as we work to be a more sustainable school district, anything we can do to encourage biking and walking from our families is a step in the right direction. So I encourage anybody to walk that path and see what it's like for, a third grader to cross Atherton. And, stories from parents, they will tell you that there are people who rush through a yellow light or, it can be pretty dangerous. So I'd really like for the district to consider looking at crossing guards for Radio Park. Thanks.
I have a question about that because of the Radio Park's like on the edge of the borough and Ferguson, so I'm not sure some of the intersections of concern might be within State College Borough and some might be within Ferguson.
Correct. And the intersection for which we were going to do this traffic study is in Ferguson. I find it very difficult to respond to the request for crossing guards on Atherton because I don't think that in that location students are assigned to be walkers on the opposite side of Atherton because of it being a main thoroughfare, but I can't speak to that completely. So we can study that further.
Right, and Ollie and his dad talked about, they have taken the bus, but they find it to be, and I agree with them, a wiser use of resources to have people within the distance that they are able to walk. So it just might be a good investment.
Keep in mind, you could end up paying both because we could not make everyone become a walker because of that roadway.
Right.
So we could end up paying for a crossing guard, but we don't assign crossing guards. Those are assigned by the borough. So we can pursue all of that. I'm not denying any of that. I'm just putting all of the facts out on the table.
And the other consideration, just I totally support what you're saying, Lori, as well. In an ideal world, we like people who could walk on whatever days they could walk, and if they have to take the bus on other days, if maybe their parent is home 3 days a week to accompany them, that would be the ideal. But I know there's been other times where we've needed crossing guards for other places where we really have to have them because of walkers, and have struggled to fill that position. To find, even though we're willing, or whomever is willing to have that position be paid for, we haven't been able to find anybody who's willing to take the job. So I just want the community to be aware that that's sometimes really difficult. Even when we want to have a crossing guard, sometimes we are challenged to find someone who's up for that task. So
Good point.
Yeah.
Randy, I don't believe Atherton's even, you said that's not technically deemed a dangerous road by the state. I don't think the state would require us. I think you could require walking there.
I don't know the answer.
Yeah. I just have had a little experience, unfortunately, with that. But I do think the point of double paying would be the challenge I think
Right.
we'd be faced with.
Yeah, I understand. I think it's worth a look, and I think it encourages behaviors that will last a lifetime for people to consider how they get to work, how they, make choices about going to the store, et cetera, so.
I think that's an area where the borough has been really concerned about the safety of crossing, because they did lower the speed limit to 25 in that part of Atherton. And they've had a few traffic studies looking at how to improve safety there, because there have been actually at least one fatal accident in the last few years.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
Park there were. But Randy, maybe that's one question though we could ask of, like, which intersection at Atherton if people just simply chose to walk, even if they weren't required to walk, like if most are crossing at Cherry Lane or things like that, and could we find out from whoever the municipality is about the duration of the time for crossing? Because like, I know I grew up across from a shopping center, and so the time that the light was green
Yeah.
in order for you to cross was really
That can make a
tight on a
difference.
5-lane highway, and I used to have to book it to get across safely. So I just wonder a little bit about what the most common intersection is used for those kids that are walking, and maybe we could just check on if we could at least find out, is there a way to extend that time so that parents with little kids,
Right.
have the most safe, possibility to get across the road. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? I don't know how we would do that, but that's just a thought.
There's generally walk lights there.
Yeah, I know there's,
Yeah.
but
So that extends the
could they be a
time.
couple seconds longer because we've
Especially
got
with little
young kids?
kids.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking it's not easy to get a kindergartner, first grader to pick it up, across
Oh,
the
yeah.
road.
Well, and even making a determination about where they cross on Atherton, because there is no sidewalk on the left side, right? I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but boy, it would be nice to have a sidewalk on that side of the street where you end up at Radio Park. So, I mean, I think that this is a long-standing concern. If you talk to teachers who are outside watching the traffic come in, without a four-way stop, you've got cars backing up all the way onto Blue Course. It's just, yeah, it's a not a good situation. But anyway, thanks, Ollie, if you're watching.
Oh, Lori, thank you for following up on that invitation.
Oh, he was adorable. We talked baseball and ice cream, and it was the best.
It was on my list of things to do, and I managed to neglect it. So thank you very much
He's
for taking the lead on that.
So the process with this, after Ferguson Township does the traffic study, that would let us know if we meet the warrants in order to be allowed to provide that four-way stop sign. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Right. So it's not necessarily up to our discretion.
But
Simply,
understand that that's completely different than the 5-minute discussion about Atherton Street, too.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
that's in the
Right.
borough.
I do
Right,
understand that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I knew you did. I was not for you.
Yeah.
So we'll be looking at both of those situations then.
But I guess I was speaking so that I know there were a number of families who contacted us urging us to go ahead and put that stop sign in. But for, anyone watching who was concerned about, like, this is a required part of the
step.
process that we have to
Correct.
meet a warrant in order to be allowed to pursue that.
Right.
Correct.
Laurel?
Sorry. I just wanted to double check. We don't see any delay in it happening because of this.
No.
Correct?
It-
Okay,
this-
that was just my only concern when I first
Traffic
read
study
it.
would be at the same time, no matter what,
Okay, that was all I wanted to make sure about.
Okay.
or at the
All
same
right.
period of time.
Okay, so in terms of next steps for us, would we hear back after they've conducted the traffic study then?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so item B is fiscal stewardship as a category. We're going to be looking at the SCASD Education Foundation Memorandum of Understanding. This is shown in attachment 6B. And I'll let Dr. O'Donnell open this. What I would say, from my perspective, is getting board input on this draft would be helpful so that we could have further conversations with
And-
their group.
Not to interrupt, but there was an error in the document that was placed earlier So the document that's there now is correct, and a paper copy is at your place tonight. And I apologize, that was my error. There's not a lot of differences between the two, but what is in place now is the appropriate document.
Okay.
I think as Amber said, the key points, obviously there's some change being requested. And so for the big key points that were discussed in Finance Committee, I think what we're looking for is direction. Are there any items here that cause us to have any further discussion with the Foundation Board on what they're proposing? Obviously, we do need action this month. And they've asked you to take action on this.
I have a few small questions, but I will defer to let others go first since I've talked about this a fair amount already. So, Dan?
A quick question, and we do this often enough or not often enough that I wind up having to get reintroduced to some of the details in our relationship with the foundation and so on, and including the role of the executive director. According to, and I know there was a period where we were involved with the revision of the contract for the executive director, for example. In terms of their budget and the cost through this MOU, it talks about the foundation being responsible for contracting with the executive director. Does that mean that that person's compensation comes out of, it was partially funded through the $120,000 annual payment that we provide them? Okay.
My understanding is that then what they're asking is to have the contract with the executive director be between the Foundation Board and that individual.
Right.
And that they would pay them out of their budget.
Right.
Which includes the $120,000.
So
which, it's obviously up to our discretion year to year in our budgeting process. But
in terms of thinking about where our costs come from, which are from people or personnel costs, and it's unrealistic to think they're going to be the same from year to year. So looking at this going forward, I mean, the Foundation Board would need to be able to the extent that, and I can't speak to the content of the contract with the executive director, but if they were to compensate that person at a higher level from year to year, they would need to find revenue beyond the 120, or at least if that's their baseline, they'll have to take from something else to be able to provide for that person's compensation. Does that seem correct?
And I think I noticed one of the key phrases in here that, now I'm looking for it, about how they would do that this in item 6C, number 6, that the foundation would seek input from the district superintendent and the finance and operations officer regarding the contract terms, including compensation and evaluation. Okay. So there still continues to be sort of this feedback loop.
Right. And there are built-in incentives, as I recall, for a heightened level of compensation based on performance.
Right.
So
that's how it's been structured.
If you think about that relationship between contributions and this 5% increment, for example, being connected to the need to compensate the executive director accordingly for their performance, there's it could be a realistic association between the need for additional revenues to compensate the executive director for heightened level of performance.
Potentially, and I think that wasn't, at least in the conversations that I've had with their board members, and Scott may be able to speak to this as well. It was, that request I think was more related to wanting to be able to expand some of their outreach and how they're running their operations to be able to do more fundraising activities.
Right.
They didn't tie it, at least in any of our conversations, specifically to that compensation issue.
All right, thank you.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just going to bring up, this was, the MOUs was discussed at length during the Finance Committee. I don't think any specific, resolution or, was developed or came as a result of that, but it was discussed in depth.
Scott, did you have your hand up?
Yes,
Yeah.
Randy or Scott, I'm sorry I didn't get this to you earlier. I understand most of the changes, but I was sort of curious about C2 and the striking of investments limited to or subject to policy 609. I'm assuming they're not going to have very aggressive investments, but can you explain a little bit of the thinking of striking that restriction or?
I believe it was just that there wasn't the expectation of having, investments per se that would have, that would have fallen under that anyways. So yeah, it would just be a direct pass through.
I was hoping that was what the answer was.
I also was trying to separate, that was actually a suggestion of mine, separating the district from the foundation more formally.
Lori?
Well, then, I'm sorry, but on that, then why do we have the word invest in, if they're not going to be making investments, then should that just also be stricken? Because it says solicit, collect, invest, and administer funds.
I don't necessarily think that they'll have, I'm not saying that, I don't think that they won't have investments.
Okay.
I would hope that they develop their own investment policy.
Okay.
To manage the risk tolerance that they as an organization have, just like we do.
And that's what's covered in 609. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar enough with the numbering to.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So it's about risk stuff. Okay.
Risk tolerance, yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
That comes from state school code probably as well.
I'm sorry?
There's also restrictions that we have from the state in terms of.
Probably, yes. I'm not sure that they're in school code, but there are restrictions, yes.
Okay. That makes sense.
That might be different than would apply to an organization like
Correct.
a 501c3. So, Lori?
Oh,
sorry.
yeah. In the committee meeting, we had talked about applying the 5% to pledges that we already have on the table right now, and I wondered if there was any language that resolved that, or if there's support to consider encouraging that to be addressed in this MOU?
My preference was for the language to be forward-looking.
Yes. So if there's a way to include language that says that this would be effective moving forward from this date, pledges moving forward, that would make me more comfortable, simply because I just find it tough to chew on the idea that we're going to go back to people who've already pledged and ask them, and let them know that we're taking 5% for something that wasn't part of the initial agreement. So I don't know if there's an appetite for that from others.
I agree.
Yeah,
I think we talked about this a couple times in different finance committee meetings.
I do, and I think it was a lengthy discussion at the committee meeting, but for the sake of
Right.
those who couldn't be there and it wasn't a recorded meeting, I think, yeah, it might be just good for, as you said, you're asking who else would support that. I think it would be helpful to make sure that that's clear, what board members feel that that's important, because, and I too, I think that it's a little bit challenging to go on this previous years when previous bylaws and such were that 100% of donations went straight to the district. So if that's going to be a change, it does seem that moving forward is the most forthright with the community.
I'll probably go around the table then. Laurel? Gretchen, you'd already spoken.
Yeah,
Dan, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, the only other thing I'd say, as I'm reading through this, I was taking an even more conservative view to this and thinking about the possibility. And I'm just throwing this out just for the sake of not for discussion even, just to say that we've covered as many bases as we might. And I'm realizing this is, I'll be in the minority about this, but it occurred to me that there's a difference between the work that goes into a lot of small contributions, just the management of that money and the kinds of conversations that go back and forth with Randy's office about the management of those contributions, and just the number of small incremental amounts involved with that. I'm inclined to think of those as being taking energy, if nothing else, in terms of the labor on the part of the board to be able to manage those contributions. So, do we want to attach some kind of fee to those amounts, relatively small amounts? But the single donor, the large restricted funds donations, and we certainly have a set of those now, but going forward, is that something we need as much as 5% as a fee, basically fee for service on those amounts? And that's just my own naive take on this. It's not. I'm just simply saying that there might be. If there were a language that's essentially said that we'd be looking at, would not be applying that 5% fee for attaching the 5% fee for single donor restricted funds donations, but everything else would come under the requirement for a 5% fee.
That is where I had started from in my
Okay.
thinking, but then I think there is a sort of a limiting factor built in with C4 in the way that it's worded.
Okay.
That it's not necessarily that they're taking 5% of all the prior year's cash receipts. It's only for fundraising expenses in excess of the annual $120,000 provided to the foundation by the district.
Okay.
So only if their budgeted fundraising expenses exceed the annual $120,000,
Got it.
they would only take 5% up to that point, not that they are taking 5% of all revenue.
Got it.
Does
Okay.
and that was your understanding, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
And Dan, for the group, this is not a high percentage. Large gifts are almost always fall into this category as well, as far as a percentage of them used for the operation. And I do think in the long term, this is, although it's a small step, it's a step in the right direction for us to hopefully someday have a self-sustaining operation. If we don't go in this direction, we won't have that opportunity down the road. Hopefully it continues to do well. It should be a results-driven function, and the foundation, I think, has exceeded expectations, and they've really assembled and continued to update their board membership in a way that has really brought in a wide range of experiences and professional minds. So they sure are positioned well, as we come out of the pandemic to really get after the annual campaign side of things. Obviously, with Mr. Bean's gift and what they did through their processes, that was I never thought when we started this we'd be looking at gifts that size.
So now, every iteration we have and every time we talk about it is somewhat helpful in having it, trying to fit all the gears together in this big machinery. So while I know you didn't get all the way around the table, but while several of us have expressed some concern that this shift should potentially be prospective, I guess it may be a moot point, though, if their spending in this past year is not going to exceed the 120 as is. If that's the framing of C4, that they would only take that additional 5% to meet billing above 120, and if they haven't met 120 this past year, which is nearly over, they wouldn't even need to do it retrospectively
It's
Am I understanding that right?
It's prospectively.
It
They're
is
looking-
definitely
It's
prospectively.
as I
But only
understand
one
it.
year at a time, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. But it would be they would look at the receipts from, let's use actual years.
Yes.
So they would look at receipts from 2021 and go up to 5% max in order, if they believe that their budget for 21-22 is going to exceed 120,000. Then they would, let's say that their budget is 130,000 for 21-22, then they would withhold $10,000 or up to whatever percentage that is to supplement their budget for the next year.
But they can't, with the wording of this, and Dr. Etter, if you are looking at C4 on page 4, my understanding of this, as it's worded, they could not, for example, take 5% of each year's cash receipts and sort of like put it in a bank account so that like in 23, 24, they can use that money for that year's budget. So it's only for,
The only way that we could move towards a more self-sustaining model is to do that, yes. So what Dr. O'Donnell said about that this would not be, that they would be more self-sufficient is that we'd have to be that each year's earnings or fee or whatever you want to call it would be then stay at the foundation and would be built up for future years, correct?
but this doesn't.
This is just 1 year at a time, you are correct.
Right. So that, interpreting that correctly then, right?
I think we might be able to modify the language a little bit to make it clearer, but yeah, I don't disagree with your interpretation.
And one of the questions I had about the wording in C4, in order to make it clearer, where it says the foundation and the district may agree that certain restricted fund donations will not be used for fundraising expenses. And we had talked about some of the pass-through functions, including like the all-night party, which hopefully will be able to happen again next year, where donations come in for that purpose. Their checks may be written to the foundation, but it's just a pass-through for a particular event. So that might be an example of the kind of fundraising expense that would not be part of this 5%, consideration. But so, to me, the question is, what is the process for the foundation and the district to come to that agreement?
Right.
I think slightly more specific language there, whether it is that the foundation, whether it's that the foundation board and the superintendent, or our board, or the superintendent and the finance officer. But I think we need to somehow define the district a little bit better in that sentence, just so that we know who's needs to actually work on sitting down to come up with that list.
It seems to me that it's a relatively, and maybe I don't know enough about the process, saying that it's simple and straightforward. But if the fund is to be used for a certain purpose, whether it is for construction, whether it's for the administration, whether it's for a classroom initiative or whatever, and it says that, then by definition, the fund cannot be used, in my mind, for expenses of the foundation. If the funds are unrestricted, or if they're specifically donated to cover the expenses of the foundation, then I think it can. So I don't know that I would say that we need to agree, because I think the language of the donated funds would answer that question.
Which I guess comes back to Dan's question about major gifts that are for a naming opportunity, for example.
Well, thinking about a restricted fund, the band uniform fund, for example, which was one of the themes for
Maroon and
the
gray.
maroon and gray, right, exactly. And that would be a restricted fund in terms of using it. So, at the same time, but those were a lot of individual donations that added to that, not a single donor. So I'm kind of betwixt and between about that. I think given the work would go into managing the costs in the sense of accounting for those funds and then distributing those funds, that might take a certain amount of the foundation's budget, or part,
Well, I
effort
think
on the
if-
part of the
if-
team, and maybe the executive director to address that, as opposed to one large dollar amount dedicated to a particular facility, which came from a single donor. It's a different situation.
Scott, did you?
Yeah, so I think we have to be a little careful as we move through this, just because we have to assume some good intent here.
Yeah.
And,
We are.
the maroon and gray, as an example, is a fundraising event. Now, it just so happens that each year, the maroon and gray has a target audience for that fundraising, and band uniforms. Well, that doesn't make everything that goes to maroon and gray a restricted fund. That's the targeted audience for that event. Scott, I think, we probably need to find out legally relative to, restricted funds and administrative fees, because I can't imagine that, I'm not saying you're wrong at all, but I can't envision a scenario where you could have a nonprofit that has all restricted funds and can't take any administrative fees, therefore can't exist.
I think we have to be careful how we word things.
Yep.
So that if the maroon and gray dinner, or whatever the event is technically called, we're supporting this year, this particular activity, rather than all funds collected are going to
Right.
this activity.
Right.
I think that kind of attention to language
Be more
is,
important.
in my view, the way it should be approached. And also, when Paul or others on behalf of the foundation are soliciting funds, I think they can make that clear as well. You're giving us $1 million, we would like to use 5% of that on the administrative side. Is that acceptable to you? So that should be part of the solicitation process.
Yeah.
So Scott Etter, so that's my question though, is trying to understand that if we pass this to take in effect, June 30th of 2021, right? Because we're talking about June 2021 moving forward. And the way I understood, the way Randy explained it, the retrospective look at receipts versus moving for the prospective budget, would the foundation then be looking at retrospective receipts from June of 2020 through June of 2021? And if that's the case, my understanding is the way the bylaws have been that 100% of proceeds, I mean, that's in the bylaws of the foundation, that 100% of the proceeds go back to the district. So would they really be able, if we pass this, can they really, can they do that for that past year, or will I have to wait another year for them to look at 2021 to 2022 and then hold some portion of that? Like that's I think the hang up that a lot of board members have, is that if they're looking at the past year to hold some portion to supplement the prospective year, when is it reasonable to say that that's okay, because this past year's receipts have been under that presumption the way we understand it?
Wait, Scott.
Am I asking the question right?
Hold on 1 second.
I understand the
Amy,
question.
just
Okay.
one correction.
Sure.
You referenced bylaws. It's not in the bylaws. It was in the previous MOU.
Which is
Okay, sorry, in which document? I apologize, yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that everybody was correct.
And
Gotcha.
that MOU is through June of 2021.
Correct.
Right. So that's the hang up I think some board members have in trying to be clear with the public, because any donations made in this past year, our understanding is under that
Were under
MOU,
the
that was what was portrayed. So how do we make these two MOUs jive and be accurate with the promises, or not promises, but whatever the
Representation of,
yeah,
Right.
that's a good word.
Yeah, which is why I was looking for some language that says that this would take effect, receipts, pledges receipts from the year beginning July 1st.
Of 2021.
Those would then become eligible for the 5%. What happened in the past is not, because they happened under different rules. Right.
Is that accurate, what we're understanding, Scott?
So, and what Randy and I, when I first saw this a couple weeks ago, or whenever it was, and we had a conversation, that was the question I had asked about, is it in bylaws, where is it? And Randy has confirmed that it's in the MOU. So I like to, when I see contracts like this, to spell it out, the impact. So as I see C4, if in a current year, if this is the agreement or the language or the concept that we're going to accept, am I correct in doing my math that we need to collect, the foundation needs to collect $2.4 million before the 5% in this provision comes into effect? Is that right?
No.
Why not? If we're, 10% would be $200,000.
They're not expected to collect the $120,000.
But it's 5%
5%
of the 120. So if 5% is 120.
5% of any revenue.
They're collecting 5%
Up to.
in order to fund the difference between actual expenses and 120, should the actual exceed 120.
Yeah. It's a concern with how it's the wording here is not
So
clear.
what I'm saying is, so if we're getting over, if we're tying 5% to the 120,
We're not.
but why aren't we? If we have, I think we have to get to 2.4 million before
No.
the 5% comes into play.
No, because then why would we take the district, why would the foundation take the district money at all? They would have enough to fund themselves at 5%.
But
It's not intended to be, you've earned enough to cover your way. It's, the district is providing 120 of ongoing seed money for expenses. And if the foundation exceeds that expenditure line of 120, then it can look back and take 5% of the proceeds to cover the shortfall of the actual versus the 120, not of all donations, as if they had to pay their own way with 120.
So that's why it's
then
up
it
to
needs to be
5%.
reworded slightly to
Yeah.
reflect that.
Yeah, but it's actually, to me, it's very clear, because it says, may spend 5% of prior year cash receipts, period. What are you spending it on? Current fundraising expenses in excess of the 120. So it's two pieces.
So if their budget is at 118, they can't withhold the 5%.
Right, they wouldn't need to, right.
They wouldn't need to. What
Correct.
if it's 125?
Then they would be able to take up to the percentage that gives them $5,000.
What if they only collected $1 million the prior year?
Then it would be 5% of, up to 5% of $1 million. Up to, that's the key element, is up to 5%, but only to the amount of that expense shortfall, or that revenue shortfall.
I was reading it to be that they had to get the 2.4
Yeah,
million before the 5%.
No, I understand where your calculation was.
That's how I had read
but
it the
don't
first time I
think-
read it,
don't
too.
think
So
that's-
was I,
that's how
Scott.
it's written.
Yeah.
So, obviously, given the differing interpretations, we need to work on to make sure that it expresses.
It's
the
not
intent
ambiguous.
and that anyone voting understands what it means.
Yeah.
And I think that the timing question needs to be spelled out clearly.
Well, and yes, however, this first year is going to be a transition no matter what. Because, I've talked to Randy separately, there's going to be a transition from the back office operating elements. This can't just on July 1 suddenly be, flick a switch and suddenly, everything goes through, differently from the foundation standpoint. So it's definitely going to be a transition year, but I also don't think the budget is over 120 this year. So.
Yeah, and I'm sure that that's the case, but I think having it spelled out clearly is important. And to your point, Scott, about, I don't think this is at all about questioning intent. I think it's just about, the confusion just in general about restricted or unrestricted, about the date of this. I just think the clarification of these specific language choices could be really useful for the administration, for the foundation board, and for us in general, just to understand how this is all going to operate in detail. Because I think when we get down to the question of details of implementation, the last thing we want to do is be arguing over the meaning of, C4 or something like that.
The word
So,
may.
Yeah. So I'd love to just get clarification on, if it's agree that donations defined as restricted, as opposed to just certain restricted fund donations, or, so that we know up front that we're defining this as restricted or it's defined as unrestricted, and how that gets implemented in a fundraising campaign, et cetera, would be super useful for avoiding issues down the road.
Yeah, and I get that, and I'm not arguing one way or
Yeah.
the other. I get that, the intent on it is there with the language.
Sure.
But it's also intended to be loose enough to allow for other situations that might occur that we can't anticipate. Perhaps there's a unrestricted gift that between the district and the foundation, they determined that, no, that one should be treated separately. So
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to anticipate, all possible avenues, which again is just why the language was written the way it was, to allow the foundation and the district to come together and, define how that might,
Yeah.
how that might occur going forward.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I just worry sometimes that the looseness of it can create ambiguity, and then that can get muddy for everybody in terms of how we're looking at the dollars. So, yeah, I totally hear what you're saying.
So I think Lori had a question that was important perhaps for Scott Etter to look at.
What's the
Is
transition?
how we transition from the previous MOU to the next
Yeah.
MOU in terms of donations or pledges that were made during the 2020-2021 fiscal year. And so
Right.
even if it's a moot point, I think it needs to be included clearly in this language, because if those donations were made under the previous MOU that said that 100% of proceeds go directly to the district and did not have this 5%, then we need just to make sure that we're on solid ground in terms of how we word that transitional year. Does that question make sense?
Well, I believe the revenues or the monies collected from the prior year will still 100% go to the district. They're just being used in this context, and tell me if I'm wrong, as the calculation for the 5%.
Can't do that.
You're correct. However, in the first year,
confusing.
I think the point is, in the first year of this MOU, funds that were collected in the prior year were collected under a prior MOU.
Right.
Therefore, can the foundation, even legally per se, deduct a 5% charge from
No.
well, and I guess here's the other question, and this is something that Randy and I had talked about, the challenge of accounting for this, looking back. Essentially what will have to happen is that 5% will have to be reserved in some way. And then if it's not all used, it's then released back into, a general fund to come back to, the district from that standpoint, which is also why, the agreement between the district and the foundation on what's restricted or not is important, because those restricted funds have a different set of accounting process. But in that situation, really, in year one of this MOU, there aren't any funds to be able to reserve against, because that happened in a prior MOU.
Do you write the
And I-
check July 1 for 120, or do you do it through the year?
We don't do that now.
To pay the expenses.
Now we just pay the expenses as
Okay.
they're incurred, and this doesn't say how we're going to do it either yet.
Okay, so some of the
Well, there's a
operating,
transition. Yeah,
so, yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, it's an accounting standpoint. But to your question, Lori, I think the MOU that exists for the next 23 days, I guess, so 100% of the monies collected by the foundation through June 30th, 2021 will come to the district. The amount collected from July 1, 2020 through June 30, 2021 will be used for, if we continue with this C4 language, that will be used to calculate the up to 5%. And then the monies that are collected on and after July 1st, 2021, when we work on the second sentence of C4, to the extent that they are completely unrestricted, they can go to be used for that up to 5%. To the extent that they are from,
what I'd call focused giving, rather than 100% giving, they could be used for that 5%. But if they are, the language is such that I give you $1 and it can only be used for X purposes, which do not include administrative expenses of the foundation, then it can't. So I think we need to be sophisticated with the use of our language in the solicitation process, in the function process, and otherwise. So it should be clear. It's certainly clear from our perspective, but it should be clear to the donor that these funds are completely unrestricted and can be used for any subject under the sun related to the district, or some of the monies collected could be used for administrative expenses, but the majority of the funds collected will be used for whatever purposes, or 100% of the funds must be used for this purpose and only this purpose.
Yeah, thank you.
That's helpful. So maybe we could work with you on that wording between now and the next meeting. Then I think the question of pledged amounts that have not yet been received, if they were pledged under a certain expectation, then.
When you do your accounting at the foundation, do you do it funds pledged or funds received?
Funds pledged.
Okay, so, I mean, so as long as
I
you're
mean,
consistent.
No.
Pledges are for the major gifts,
Mm-hmm.
and any pledges made at a Maroon and Gray event. Everything else is on receipts.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, the one agreement that we approved relatively recently, you're getting payments.
We
over
have
a
three,
period of
we
time.
have three major pledges,
Mhm.
and then we have Maroon and Gray pledges that when there's an event in May, sometimes those pledge cards that are collected in May are not, those payments are not received until July or August. So those are pledges. And then we also are taking payments for locker sales at naming opportunities, which are not the $1 million variety, but they're $1,000 variety, and they're still coming in over a period of time as well.
But as far as how we work the books, don't we wait till, we don't count it till the funds are received, correct?
No, everything's recorded on a pledge basis.
So I think my question.
That's what we're required to do under fund accounting.
For Dr. Etter then is so a pledge that was received, the pledge was received under the existing MOU. Even though the monies might be received under the new MOU, the pledge was received under the prior MOU in which we said 100% of donations went to the district.
Yeah, I understand what you're
Yeah.
saying. I want to go back and look at the exact wording of
Okay.
the 100%. I assume
Okay.
It's not on the strike-through language here, Andy, or is it?
I don't remember.
No, I don't think this
No.
has the original, this is,
But
this is a
this says
modification.
cash receipts, so I think for those, it would be when the money is received. So for example, there's a real small number of gifts that over multiple years. Some of the gift has been received. Since they're saying cash receipts, some of those could qualify for the 5%. For those large gifts, I think because of the timing, I think there should be a conversation with, it's a very small number.
Yeah, it's like N equals 3 or something like that. And it should be just a conversation, right? Because what you're talking about is that pledges received but are paid for in installment payments, like the Dribblebis gift, for instance.
Correct.
So that you're saying, is the ones received next year eligible for the 5%? And maybe that should be a conversation with the donor.
Right. I don't
Yeah.
know what the foundation has discussed on that, but.
Yeah.
And I guess my concern is partly that ensuring that we're on solid ground from a legal perspective, that the language here is clear and that what we've said previously is clear and that nothing's unclear to a donor or anyone in the public on how that's being calculated. And it may be a moot point in that, we may not be taking 5% of any prior years, or the foundation might not need 5% of a whole year's cash receipts for it, because their budget might not be that much in excess of 120,000. So it may be that even having that conversation might be avoided by focusing on funds that were not part of a large pledge like that, if that makes sense, such as the annual giving. Laurel?
Another clarification question. I heard you a while ago, or someone say something about year-to-year decisions through the action of the board.
Right.
But in fact, I'd like some clarification, because it's true that this says any and all devotion of district funds shall be within the sole discretion of the school board, but then that's in the introduction to B, or the first paragraph. B4 says the district shall contribute. So I think we need to be very clear about whether this is a binding agreement for the term of an annual payment for the term of the agreement, or is it year to year at the discretion of the board? So I'm tossing that
So
back to you,
that's-
Dr. Etter.
B,
The last sentence of the introduction under commitment says, any and all devotion of district funds or resources under this agreement and in any fiscal year shall be within the sole discretion of the school board, which is pretty much what it's been heretofore.
fairly clear, yeah.
But under 4, it says the district shall contribute. Okay.
I think the previous MOU had similar wording.
Well, because it was year to year at the discretion.
It was,
Which sentence?
but I think the same inconsistency existed in the previous MOU.
There were some differences.
Okay.
Specifically, what is the now stricken C3, which I'll come back to. So if we could just make sure that we know what we're talking about. I had also wondered about the investment agreement, and that's when I'd gone and looked at the policy and seen that it was about risk tolerance, and to me, that point out one of the challenges that we're dealing with, which is that a public school district does have different risk tolerance than a private nonprofit. So once I understood that, but people need to do that, because I think in a lot of people's eyes, they don't really see much separation between the foundation and the district. And if there were a truly risky investment that put people's $1 million donations at risk, that might be disconcerting if they're sort of assuming that this group, which is so tightly linked to the board, to the district, is operating in a similar investment fashion. So we might want to think about whether, even if it doesn't speak to that specific district policy, there is language that we want about some, I don't know what it would be. I don't know enough about.
Well, can we
risk tolerance.
use an example? Let's say that you get the foundation gets a $100,000 check, and it gets it on Monday the 1st. How quickly does it come into the district funds? And what happens to it before it comes to the district?
Depends.
Well, what's a typical example?
It could be as little as the same month, it could be several months away. Depends on what the purpose of the gift is for.
Yeah, if I could interject, I think the context on this is, 99% of whatever the foundation's activity is going to be based on a predetermined district need. So if there's a predetermined district need, theoretically, there's no reason for the foundation to hold that as if it's just doing a general annual fund. And even that general fund typically has the student opportunities grants or something else that, where the money might be accumulating, but it's not accumulating for a period of time that's long enough that probably warrants some larger investment consideration. So I think the larger items are going to pass through fairly quickly as soon as the board has the need for those funds.
You want a liquid safe and conservative, or.
Yeah, the money market, something like that.
So that's what it's gonna be. It's not, you're not gonna put it into a stock. The foundation's not going to invest in a stock or
I would
something
hope
of that
not,
nature.
yes.
So we can hope. The question is whether we want to put it in there. So then, the other point was, I don't want to dwell a lot on the 5%, except to say that I originally also had calculated out the 2.4 million. And I think it's true that 5% would not be much for administrative costs, but 120,000 could be a lot depending on what is brought in. And from the very beginning, part of the reason that the district fronted the money was so that we could specifically say everything that comes into the foundation goes to the district. And it was a little bit of, because the district was putting money in, but it did allow people to feel it was coming straight back. So just wanted to make that comment. In terms of the 5%, or whether it was 3% or 10%, my impression is that the foundation can set its budget. So to some extent, the budget has been set by the 120,000. But if the foundation knew it could add another 30,000, it could choose to set a budget that went up to that amount. Am I correct about that?
I think so. I think I understand you correctly, yes.
So I think that's one of the things we're saying, well, only if they need it, but they set the budget based on what they know they have available, as most of us do. So I think there is the potential for a budget to get much higher depending on what that 5% added up to.
Yes, I would assume, I'm going to go out on a limb here, I don't think it's a very long limb, but that the budget is also used to generate new dollars.
Right.
And so, with the goal of being more money raised.
Right. Yeah, and it is limited, yes. But people were saying that it seemed to think that it was decided ahead of time. It's not actually, it's decided based on what's available. There was also a comment about lots of little donors versus major donors. And I did want to check on, and I actually sent a question in, I appreciate your getting back to me, Randy, because A6 refers to the district supports the foundation through the foundation's limited use of facilities, equipment, and personnel. And I know when I have looked at other organizations, they often do have office space or things like that. So that is, we've been giving the 120,000, but we've also been providing some facilities potentially, storage, that type of thing, as well as accounting services. And in particular, for B4, which refers to the 120,000, goes on to say the district shall keep detailed records. And later on, it also refers again to the district being responsible for the accounting functions. And when I checked with you, you said currently the finance and accounting staff provide about 20 hours per week.
An estimate. But yes.
Estimate, right. But that adds up to a lot of money, because a lot of districts, a lot of foundations pay that to an accountant or to a manager, or the executive director does it. But in this case, it's not the case that if they have lots of little donors, they'll have a need for greater money, because the district is still going to be doing that. It's something we should be aware of, because it is another in-kind gift support that we're providing. With all of that, I want to go to the one other thing that had come up in the meetings a couple of times is the term of this, which is 5 years, and it was brought up that school board members have a 4-year term, and that and we don't have many contracts other than some with our associations that are close to 5 years even. And I think I had heard at the finance meetings, both times that we discussed it, a strong preference for a shorter term, at most 4 years.
I remember that too.
Hey, Laurel, could I respond on a couple? Just because you had some more that you wanted to go
Yeah,
through, right?
no,
Just
yeah,
while-
absolutely.
Just while they're fresh,
Sure.
and they're actually related. So the item related to, B and B4, I believe this is an attempt to find middle ground, because this is a contract. On the other hand, it's also a recognition that for a school board, a budget is developed and, and submitted and approved on an annual basis. So even though this is a contract, a future board could theoretically choose to not fund this and break the contract, and then it is what it is. There is no MOU anymore. It doesn't mean the foundation is gone. It just means there is no MOU between the district and the foundation, and the foundation, I guess, theoretically can then run its own operations based on whatever, it feels that its needs are. So I think I think the language in 4 is fine, but I think the last sentence in the opening paragraph is that intent to find some middle ground into a long-term contract that, yes, does, exceed a board member's term, but also recognizes that this is an annual recommitment by each board, however it's composed, at that time based on the budgetary process. So it's not perfect. There's lots of this. We have 2 entities that are trying to find common ground on this to be able to move forward. I can tell you that the term portion of it, it's so that there isn't a need to come back and have these lengthy discussions year after year on the MOU and the components on it, et cetera. So it's the attempt to get that long-term foundation in place that then just lets us all go about what we do best and focus on that versus spending as much time as we do legitimately, but to try to figure this out and to justify it. So again, it's an attempt to find a middle ground on that. So
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah, because basically you can't really twist an arm, but it's meant to be mutually understandable. And I think if we sign this, even if a future board could do that, the expectation of the foundation is we've made a commitment. The intention of the board is we've made a commitment. But as you said, it does help. If there were a reason somewhere along the way, it gives that middle ground, so.
Yep, and thank you for letting me interject that.
Yeah, no, not at all. Because the other thing I wanted to talk about, and just very briefly, when we started down this road in 2015, and we talked about the need you got to spend money to make money. I think the striking C3, which is the agreement by the foundation, the expectation that they would continue to raise at least $120,000. Obviously, if they fall short, they fall short. We can't help it if they do, and we assume good intent. But to not even have that expectation in there is really pretty troubling to me. I don't know why it would have been thought why they even considered striking it. The foundation shall raise gifts and/or commitments in an amount equal to or greater than $120,000. That sort of seems like it should be. I guess it goes without saying, and maybe that's why they struck it. But that's odd to me that they would strike it. I think, though, it does tie into the whole way this has been constructed. The elephant in the room for me, with all the details, and they're important to talk about, and it's been a good conversation about what the intent and what the desire is. At this point, the seed money has been over $500,000. We are approaching $600,000 plus of taxpayer money that has gone to the foundation. The foundation has returned more than that, no question, especially with the generosity of Mr. Beans, Mr. Drivelbest, our anonymous donor, and many other small donors. It's still a lot of money, and I've done a lot of research trying to find any other foundation that has come close to that from any documentation I can find. I haven't. If the foundation, the folks on the foundation, can share some information about other foundations that work this way, it would ease my conscience a lot in terms of how we are spending taxpayer money. So.
Gretchen?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about the term, the 4-year term of a board member versus the 5-year contract that Laurel has brought up. And it wasn't actually Laurel that originally brought it up, it was Jim. in a finance committee meeting. And I see Scott's point. I understand the logic behind it. On the other hand, with a 4-year contract rather than a 5-year, then every SCASD board member would have the possibility to contribute to the conversation. Whereas with a 5-year contract, you're actually potentially eliminating an individual board member's possibility of being able to be a part of that conversation. And, I just coming from a political science background, I'm thinking that's not very democratic, right? Because the voters are voting for candidates to come onto the SCASD board who can represent them and the community. And so you're basically eliminating the possibility of representation if you have a 5-year contract. Obviously, it's possible, as Scott has said. It's much harder because to enter into that, you'd have to have a majority of the board, 5 people, say, okay, we want to do this before the 5 years, and that can be really tough. And so it's possible within the realm of possibilities for a board member to have that possibility to be a part of the conversation, but highly unlikely, and to be able to get a majority to do that. And so therefore, just, from a democratic theory standpoint, you're really eliminating that the importance of the representation involved and the concept of why voters vote for candidates. So anyway, I also support the 4-year rather than the 5-year for lots of reasons, but those are 2 more. So thanks.
Can I get feedback on the 5 versus 4-year question then?
Because that's sort of a discrete point to bring up if we're going to ask for 4 years. It's
I guess I like the framing about being able to be part of the conversation. So that it's not intended to be 4 years versus 5 is not representing a lack of commitment or a lesser commitment. It's simply providing opportunities for everyone to be part of a conversation or process, to have some.
Thinking of a process perspective, if there is a new array of membership on the board that would change in an election cycle, that new board you'd want to give them the option of reopening the MOU. So I wouldn't be inclined to say it's 5 years, but at the 4th year, point, there's an option to reconsider the MOU, but not to revise it totally, not to go through the whole process again. So I'd like to have there to be a kind of it seems to me, thinking about this. Of course, the more comments that are made, the more complicated it gets. But I'm just thinking that there are a way to do it. I'd be inclined to say, at the 4th years, there's the board has the option to revisit the MOU. Otherwise, it within a month period, the MOU will remain in place until the end of the 5th year. It gives us the option of reopening as needed at the end of the 4th year. But I'd discourage everyone from trying to redo the whole thing at that point. There might be a small opportunity for discussion with new board membership.
Amy.
I think all those points make a lot of sense. I don't know that it's necessarily a deal breaker for me, but I think that I'm very comfortable with all those reasons, and I think they're very good. I think the bigger issue for me is just making sure we have really concrete clarity about the C4 issue.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm sort of right along the lines with Amy. I would prefer 4 years, but it's not a deal breaker.
Ditto for me. I think, moving from 1 to 4 years is a pretty good jump to begin with. So for the points Gretchen made, I would strongly prefer 4 years. But yeah, probably not a deal breaker, but I think 4 years is a smart move, particularly when we've been at 1.
Yeah, I get it. And the only thing I would add is, yeah, you might, I just can't even think of the timing of when new board members would come on in November and when negotiations would potentially start for another MOU. And in all likelihood, it would probably start within their term, and then it's a question of whether it would get completed and voted on, as an extension or something like that within their term. But I get it. I understand. I think that there's enough of a fail-safe in the language there to cover that, but it becomes, what the board is or is not comfortable with relative to the length of a contract. And for a school board, a 5-year contract is, not typical, but also not impossible.
Laurel?
Well, and things can be extended also. At the very beginning of this, it says there have been 2 previous contracts, and in a sense, that's true. But my understanding last year was that with pandemic and all, it wasn't so much that we wrote a new contract. We gave a 1-year extension to the contract that I think had started in 2018, and though we approved it year by year, we didn't discuss it every year. So we can always extend a contract. So you can word it either way. Just wanted to make that clear.
That's actually a great point, Laurel, and so I do not know where the foundation board sits on this. I've heard, definitely the preference, but some people, it's not a deal breaker. I don't know where this foundation board is on this, but perhaps if it's something that is extremely meaningful to the foundation board, it can be written in a way of a 4-year contract with automatic extension of 2 years or something like that, unless the school board says something to the contrary. It automatically renews unless the school board says no. That does give future boards, the ability to weigh in on that possible renewal. So again, I don't know where the foundation board was on that importance.
Well, and because the commitment is subject to the board's appropriation, Board Howard always has the ability. I think really to kind of in response to Laurel's comment about what other districts do support the foundation like this, I think the other question is what other districts have a foundation that are doing this to this degree? Okay, I'd like to see the evidence of.
The dissertation that the foundation brought to our attention, I'd like to talk about that. And they're much more successful if they have an executive director.
Right. But to the degree, even during the pandemic, I think they've been very successful. Obviously, I'm unaware of foundations in public schools in our state that are generating this kind of revenue for the district. I just think we're very fortunate to have this group of people who are so committed to what we've asked them to do. They've definitely hit it beyond what we expected on the front end of this.
I would agree. This is well beyond what we were imagining on the front end of this process.
So I think a piece of information is helpful. The first MOU was 3 years. We did a 1-year extension because of the pandemic.
Okay.
So I just think that's a good point of reference.
That is, yeah.
So 4 is 1 more year than 3. 5 is only 2 more than 3. Just.
From an accounting perspective, right? Yeah.
Hey, it's
I do think the idea of the 4-year contract but that it would be automatically renewed unless some action was taken, to me makes sense.
Oh.
Yeah.
So in essence, it would likely be 5.
Right. And either side could, it wouldn't just have to be that the school board might decide at 4 years that they want to reopen it, but the foundation board could at that point as well. I think this is going to continue to be a collaborative relationship where, if in 2 years the foundation board came to us and said they wanted to reopen the MOU and talk to us about some components of it, I can't imagine that that would not be received as, a conversation worth having. And like either side would be open to those discussions anyways, I think. So, yeah, I mean, I guess to me, the idea of the 4 years, but with an automatic renewal for a year at a time makes sense to me.
And again, if the MOU goes away, if it's a 1 year, 2 year, 4 year, the MOU stops and it's not renewed, the foundation doesn't cease to exist. It now has, I mean, it's actually, at this level of its development, I would argue that it's more in the interest of the SCASD board to have the MOU than it is for the foundation, because they're really at a point where they're close to being able to do that on their own, and this allows us to have that continued collaboration. So that's the other thing. I mean, in 4 years, the environment could change, and the foundation doesn't want an MOU, because they're able to go it on their own and self-fund and et cetera. So that's the other way that this could go, whether now or 4 years or whatever it might be. So.
There'd be no reason for their administrative costs to be bound to being 5% of donations. It could be a lot higher.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to wrap up the items that we were gonna, I think collaborating with Dr. Etter around the language on C4 to make sure it's consistent. And in the request that I had, there was also clarifying the language where it says the foundation and district may agree that certain restricted fund donations will not be used for fundraising expenses. Just to clarify what that process is, if we're, if it's the desire of the board to, have that be the superintendent or designee, or if we want it to be the board. I don't know. I don't have a strong feeling about that. I just think that whatever the process is should be articulated. And then Laurel's question about the consistency of the wording on B and B4, just to make sure that item 4, and maybe this is just something we could look at with Dr. Etter as well, just to make sure that we've, from a legal clarity perspective, that we've covered all our bases there.
I have notes from the conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. So we'll work together, and we'll probably hope to bring this back at the next board meeting then with some of those clarifications.
I just want to say thank you to the foundation for working on this document. And I, to be clear to the community, the level of detail that we dove into tonight is not a reflection on us not appreciating. We greatly appreciate the work of the foundation. We just want to make sure we're getting all of the nuances and details right. So thank you to the foundation for sending this to us.
Agreed.
Yep.
Okay, all right. Okay, so the next item is committee reports. Dan, Culture, Climate, and Learning.
Yeah, I want to get to something here. There we go. Yeah, there were two topics at the CCL meeting on May 26th, both related to issues of equity. The first had to do with a review of the response of the district to the question regarding disproportionality for black students, particularly in relation to disciplinary intervention. And in that session, Heather Pringle, the director of special ed, provided an overview of the steps being taken to mitigate disproportionate suspensions. And Dr. Chatters, the director of equity, talked about instances of implicit bias and the additional steps that the district is taking, including professional development for the administrative team. And that included a lengthy workshop with Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims, who basically provided support and training to the administrative team on the issues underlying this problem. In the discussion, there was careful review of the causes of the offenses related to where a student is the need for careful review of the causes for the offenses relative to when a student is engaging in this behavior and the meaning of the behavior. And there was discussion of the involvement of behavior specialists for these students who happen to have IEPs for in terms of the existence of a behavior support plan and the means by which the IEP team oversees the needs of that student. So we discussed those elements of the circumstance or surrounding these students who are over-identified for disciplinary intervention. The second topic on the agenda related to the preparation for the work session on equity audit, which the school board was to participate in a day later. And this involved preparation for a presentation by Dr. Paul Gorski and one of his associates in terms of the results of the equity audit. The audit on that date had been completed, and Dr. Gorski was to present an oral report, which is available for those at home who are interested in seeing this. That work session is available as a recording, the CNET recording titled May 27-21 State College School Board Work Session on the District's Equity Audit. Among the topics we discussed in preparation for the work session on the equity audit was some of the findings that had already been presented on paper. Dr. Gorski emphasized the need to review and revise the inclusive excellence policy. There was some question about whether PSBA would be able to assist us with the revision of the language. There's also discussion of the multi-tiered system of support process and the importance of rethinking our belief systems about behavior with an emphasis on causation. In other words, looking for underlying stressors, trauma, and so on that might be influencing the student's behavior, and the use of other interventions such as restorative practices to address the kinds of problems that students might be having. And to do this in a team basis rather than an administrator acting alone or acting independently, but working with others, which they do as well. I don't really suggest they don't already do this, but the importance of involving other specialists on the team in working out the interventions for students with discipline problems. So these are the kinds of topics we discussed at the last CCL meeting.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Scott, for finance, it seems like we pretty much covered those topics.
I have nothing to add.
Right. Thank you.
All has been discussed in great detail.
Yeah. Okay, so the upcoming committee meetings, we have facilities and grounds on the 9th at 12:30 and policy development on the 16th at 12:30. Those are both still scheduled to be virtual meetings at this time. And at this time on the agenda, we have time for public comment. If anyone who is here would like to make a public comment. And you can use the raised hand function in Zoom. Any public comment? Okay. Then seeing none, we'll move on to future agenda planning. Our next meeting is June 21st. And with that, I would like to ask for a motion to adjourn to executive session.
So moved.
Second?
Okay, so that has been moved and seconded. All in favor of adjourning? Aye?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you then. We are adjourned.